And so for this part, I'm just going to go over a basic tile set. There's a much more complicated way to do this that leads to more robust results. But for today, I'm just going to get started with some basics. So I'm going to minimize my Discord for now and my browser. But if you have any questions while I'm going through this, feel free to just start talking, and I can pause and go over it. But so I'm going to start with my tile set, and for the basic tile set, I'm just going to make a few images, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the art. I'm just going to give you guys kind of a sense of how this would look. And so I'm going to open up Pascal, and I'll close this and make this a little bit bigger. And so the first thing that I want to do with my tiles is kind of decide what size they're going to be. You could go a lot of different ways with this. It depends on what you want to do with the style of your game. One thing that you might want to consider is the size of the other elements. So my player art, I think is 64 by 64. Let's check that again. Where's my character? Tell me how big this is. Info. Properties.
Is scaling stuff down not a good idea in Godot? Like if your stuff is like too big, because you said like you want to build around the size of the character, but
Yeah. You can scale down in Godot. If you are scaling down like a lot of stuff, you may want to just like export things at a smaller resolution, because scaling does require, the computer is like doing extra work to do that scaling. But you can scale down. If you're using pixel art, you can scale up or down. If you're using like vector art or rastered art, you can only really scale down without losing resolution. If you scale up, you're going to get some blurriness.
okay.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, so this is 128 by 128, but it's 2 frames by 2 frames. So that's 64 by 64. So, I probably want my character to fit inside one of my tiles. So I'll probably start with 64 by 64, but a lot of games, depending on the level of detail, may use 32 by 32 or even smaller, like 16 by 16. So it depends on what style of game you're making. If you have like really small characters and you want to fit a lot of information into the game window, you can go smaller. You probably don't want to go a whole lot bigger than 64 by 64, because then you're just not going to have that much on the screen. But it depends on the style that you want to go for. So I'm going to change this to 64 by 64 and click resize. And for this one, I'm just making some basic tiles. So there's not actually a lot of stuff that I have to do to set up here. For some of my tiles, I want to fill them in because I want to like fill the whole background. For other ones of my tiles, I don't really need to fill them in. I could have just some scenic elements that I want to be part of my tile set. So I'm going to start for my scene. I'm going to assume that there's just a few basic types of terrain. So I'm going to have some grass. I'm going to have some rocks or kind of dirt, and then I'm going to have some water. And so I'll be able to kind of design my scene with those 3 different styles of terrain. So I'll start with just some grass. So I'll choose like a green color, and I'll just use the paint bucket to fill that in. It's a little bright, so I might choose something that's a little bit more desaturated, maybe a little lighter. That looks pretty good. And then for grass, if I want to do like some simple highlights, maybe I'll get a bigger pen size and just do a couple dots. So I'll use the lighten tool and do Command and Shift just to do a couple dots here and there. So again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the details for this because it's just a demo, but you can add more detail depending on what you're going for with your art. So I just want some dots just to give it some texture and add some grass. It's pretty light, so if I wanted to make it darker, what I could do is sample this color. So I think it's this one. And then maybe change it a bit, maybe make it a little bit darker. And then use the Paint All Pixels tool and fill all those in. So that is more visible, but that's maybe actually more dark than I want. So let's try somewhere in the middle. That looks pretty good. So this will be my grass. Obviously this is pretty basic, but I'm just gonna go with this for now for the demo. And so I'm gonna add a new frame. And so I'm gonna add some dirt just to have a different type of terrain to add. So I'll get like a light brown color and I'll use the paint bucket to fill it in. And I'm gonna turn off the preview because I'm not doing any animation. And then I'll use my lighten tool again and just hold Command and Shift and just put in some little dots for detail. I don't want them to overlap. That kind of looks weird. So I'm just gonna undo a couple of those. Okay. It looks pretty good. So I'll just be using those as, you know, kind of my basic terrain. And I'm gonna add another frame. So now I'm gonna make some water. And this is gonna be an area where my player actually cannot get to. So I'm gonna keep that in mind. So I'm gonna make like a blue color and use my lighten, darken tool again. Add, maybe for this one, instead of dots, since it's water, I'll add some lines, like some waves. Okay. Looks kind of weird. I think I need to use a smaller pencil for that. Yeah, that looks better. Okay. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I just want to have some different textures to work with. Okay, so now we have some water. That's going to look pretty goofy when I put it into Godot, but that's okay. And then I'm just going to add a couple more scenic elements if I want those to be part of my tile set. So we did some scenery last week without using the tile set. So you don't have to have these as part of the tile set, but if you want them to be part, I'll show you, we can look at how that would work. So I'll just draw like a tree, kind of like what I had last time. So I'll get another brown color for the tree. Here's my little tree trunk. I'll fill that in and then get my lighten tool and add some details here. And then I'll get a green and draw, oops, switch to the pen tool, draw my branches or my leaves. And let's fill this in. So this looks kind of bad, but I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. Let me just use my pen tool to fill these guys in. And so notice with the first 3 tiles that I made them all the way out to the edges. So for my basic tiles, it's really important that my art fills the entire sort of box of my grid. And we'll see why that is once we go to add it in. For my scenery, it doesn't really matter as much. So I'm going to add another one. And this one, I'll just do like a rock. If I want to put some rocks somewhere. So I'll get like a gray color and just draw like a big rock and fill that in. And use the lighten and darken tool to add some details. The rock, I'll just add some dots here. Okay. So very, very simple. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I have a few basic things. And actually, let's delete or erase this kind of edge over here. Okay, so this will give me some stuff just to demonstrate. So again, for my basic tiles that fill in my design, I need them to fill up the entire space of my frame. For the scenery, I'm not as worried about that. I can have some edges that are not filled in. So I have my basic tile set. I forgot to save this, but that's okay. So I can put this in art. So I want to save my Pascal file. So I'll make a new folder here. And I'll call this tile sets. And this is going to be my tiles basic. So I'm going to put tiles at the beginning. So it's It's going to be organized when I export it. So these are my basic tiles, and I'm going to export this. I'm going to go to download, and it already opens up my game because I've used this before, but if not, I would just go to the desktop, go to MMP 270, go to my game, and I'll put this in sprites. And so I'll leave it as tiles basic, so it'll organize all my tiles together, and click save. And the scale is at 1, which is good. And okay, so now I have everything set up. And so I'm going to go over to Godot and go over a basic tile set. So this is going to be really, really simple. It's not going to look that sophisticated, but it's going to be good enough if you want to do something basic for your game. I'm going to leave this Pascal open in case I want to do more edits later. I'm going to go to my MMP 270 folder, go to my game, and open up project.godot. And I'll choose the Godot engine again. And so now we're going to add in our tile set. So I'm going to go to the scenes. I have this default scene. I'm going to make a new scene so I can just add the tile set and not worry about all this other stuff. Or actually, I can leave that in there, but I'll make a new scene just so I can have this there as well. So I'm going to go to duplicate, and I'll call this tile basic scene. And so I don't actually have to remove my scenery. It might be good to leave it there to see how they interact. So I'll just start and go to open my tile basic scene and close my default scene. So I'll rename this one tile basic scene. So you don't necessarily have to do that if you know that you want to use this tile set, but for the demo, I want to put that in there. And so now we can start to add our tiles. So this is a little bit of a tricky process, the way that Godot has this set up. So you may make some mistakes the first time you try it, and that's okay. It'll take a second before everything makes sense. But to get started, I'm gonna click on my main node, and then I can click the plus to create a new node. And what I want is called a tile map. So I'm going to type in tile. I can type out all of tile map if I want, and it's going to select that. And I'm going to click create. And I'm going to bring this up to the top of my program, of my scene, because it's going to be below everything. And I'll just call this tile map basic. And now I can create my tile map. And so a lot of what we have to do is make sure our units are correct. So when we're looking at the map, if we go to our configure snap, so we have 32 by 32 with 2 steps in between. And we know that my tile set is 64 by 64. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to 64 by 64. I can always change it back to 32 by 32 later if I want. So I'm going to hit OK. So now we can see the grid areas are a little bit larger, and you can see the player fits inside of one of the grid areas, which is what I want for starting to design this. And then when I click on my tile map basic, you can see there's a section, there's a bunch of different options in the inspector. So one is the cell size, and that defaults to 64 by 64. So that's good, that's what I want. And let's see if there's any other settings we have to do. Everything else looks fine. And there's also a setting for the Y sort. And so if we want our tiles to sort with the rest of the scenery, we can turn that on. So let's turn that on for now and see if that works. And then there's also the tile origin. We're going to stick with the top left. So everything else we can leave the same. And now we can make our tile set. And so the tile set option is up here. It doesn't have anything by default. So if I want to create something, I'm going to click empty and then just click new tile set. And then when I click on the tile set, that opens up my tile editor. The tile editor is a bit tricky to use, so I'll go over it and I'll try to explain why. But one thing that we can do is we can stretch the editor up to make it easier to see, but you can also click on these little 2 arrows over here, and that'll expand the bottom all the way to the top. So whichever one is easier. There might be a key command for that too. Yeah, Shift F12. So if you want to do that as well. I usually just drag, and you'll see it's easy to get out of here once we're ready to go draw our tiles. But this is our tile editor. And so in order to edit our tile set, we actually have to add in our art. So I can use the plus button, or I can just drag it over. So if I hit the plus and go to sprites and get my basic tiles and click open, it's gonna open right here. I can delete them by hitting the trash can, and I can also go to my sprites and just drag my tiles in there. So once we have that open, you can see there's a few different controls over here. And if I click on here, nothing really happens. So there's a few things that I have to do. I'm gonna zoom in a little bit so I can hit the plus to zoom in. I can hit the 1 to go back to the default size, and I can also zoom out with the minus. And then this little info, it's not gonna show anything yet, but you'll see it shows me which tiles I've created. So one thing that's kind of tricky about the tile editor is that I can create multiple tiles on the same art, and it's easy to do that by accident. So we're gonna try to avoid doing that. But there's also a lot of contextual menus. So right now we don't really see any buttons over here or over here. And it's a little bit tricky because I have to actually create a tile before I'll see those buttons. So I'm gonna start with that. I'm gonna click new single tile. So this is the most basic tile type, is the yellow new single tile. And if I click that, it's gonna create this tile. And so now this brings up new options. And so it starts with this region. I have to choose the region. And right now I can't actually see my grid on top of my tile set. And that's gonna be helpful for me choosing the region. So if I wanna see that, I can turn on snap. And now that I have snap turned on, I can see that it doesn't actually match my art. And that's one of the things that's a little frustrating, is that I can't actually set the snap settings until I've created a tile. So if I create a tile, I'm just gonna drag this over. Now I can change the snap options. And so once I create a tile, if I click info on, you can see the name of the tile there. Now I have snap options. And so now I can change the grid to match my art. So you can see the snap options says 32 by 32. And what I want is 64 by 64. So I'm gonna change this to 64 by 64. And so now the boxes match. And it happens that I created the tile that matched the correct tile, but if I hadn't, I could just hit delete and it leaves that snap option there. So that's one of the tricky things about the tile set, is that I have to actually create my tile before I see a lot of those options. So we can create another new single tile, and I'll click on my grass, and I have some other options under here. So I don't need the snap options anymore. So once I've created a tile, you can change the name. And this is actually pretty useful because it'll show the name when we go back to edit our scene. So I'm going to change that to grass. There's a few other things that we can change here, but we don't really need them. And that's pretty much all we actually have to do for this particular tile. So I can turn the info on and off, and there we go. I have this tile. So we're gonna add a few more tiles before we go to edit, but I could go back and actually add the grass to my scene at this point if I wanted to start doing that. So let's add another tile. So I'll click on the new single tile button again, and then I'm gonna click on my dirt. And that gives me another tile. You can see the options here, and then I'm gonna change the name to dirt. I'm gonna save that. So I'm gonna keep going. I'm gonna add another tile and add my water. And I'm gonna type water here. And so the water is the first tile that I wanna make an adjustment to. I wanna make it so that my player cannot walk on the water. And the way that I do that is by adding a collision. So if I go to the collision mode section over here, it gives me some options to add the collision. So I can create a box collision. And so if I click the box and then click on the water, it's just a pretty simple box. So it actually pretty much did it exactly for me. I don't really need to do much else. We'll make some more colliders for the other objects here. But if I want to delete the collision, I can delete it, and then I can create it again. So that's pretty simple. So I have two more tiles, and I'm going to create a slightly more complex colliders for those. So I'll click new single tile again and add my tree. And let's change the name to tree. And so for this one, I might want to zoom in a little bit more. I want a more complicated collision. So if I go over to my collision, I can use the polygon, and this will let me draw points around the collision. But one tricky thing with this is that my snap is turned on. So it's not going to let me click anywhere that's not these outer areas. So I'm going to delete that and start over, and I'm going to turn my snap off. So now I can add a polygon. Oops. Uh-oh. I hit undo, but that undid the whole tile. So let's start again and click here. And let's call this tree. So that's another thing that's tricky about the tile editor. If you like undo, I guess that's, I don't know if that's a bug or if that's intended, but I hit Control Z and it just undid the whole tile. So anyway, I've got my new tile again. I'm gonna call it tree. I'm gonna go over to collision. I'm gonna turn snap off, grab the polygon, and now you can see it's letting me, oh, I guess the first time I click, okay, so anyway, it's letting me kind of like draw this collision. So the more sort of data you put here, the more complex the collision will be. But we just kind of want to draw a basic outline. Doesn't matter if it's perfect because our player is just going to run into here. Once I've created it, I can kind of move stuff around a little bit. And that's pretty close. That's going to be good enough if we don't want our player to run into our tree. You might also say, you know, I actually only want the player not to run into the base of the tree if you have Y sorting on. So you could do a collision that's just down here. So if you have Y sorting on and the player is above this kind of like tree base, then the player will be behind the tree anyway. So it kind of depends on what style game you're making, but either one would be fine. So I'll save that. And then I have one more tile to add, which is this big rock. And so I need to remember to turn snapping on. And so now I can choose that selection. I'm gonna call this rock. And I'm gonna do another collision. And so I'll turn snapping off and do a polygon. And I'll just draw around the rock. And so it's a little tricky because the first dot that you draw doesn't actually show up. You have to draw 2 dots. Okay, so I've got the rock. That looks pretty good. So I'm ready to start editing my scene. And so I'm going to, so to go back to my main scene, I just click on the tile map basic and that'll bring me back here. And then you'll see all of a sudden I can draw with my tile map. So I'm gonna start with the grass. If I click on a tile, it's gonna draw one box. If I right click, it's gonna remove it. If your snap options look like they're off, like if I have the snap is like, let's say it's like 16 by 16, then it'll be okay. But if it looks off, you can adjust it to be correct. So we want to make sure it's pretty close if it's not exact. So now each box fits into another box. So I can click and drag to draw a bunch, and I can also add this to a whole section. So if I hold Shift, it'll let me draw a line. And if I hold Command and Shift, or Control and Shift, it will let me draw a whole box. And you can see I've already got Y sorting on, so everything is looking good. If I turn Y sorting off, suddenly it's going to be on top of my scenery. So if I don't want that to happen, one thing I can actually do is just set the Z index. So I can set the Z index to -1, and so everything will be behind. But that's not going to work for my other scenic elements. So if I want to use Z sorting or Y sorting, I can turn Z back to 0 and turn Y sorting back on. So now I have some grass. And so now we can add some water down here. So I can just hold Command and Shift or Control and Shift and draw some water. And the water has a collider, so let's test it. My player shouldn't be able to walk into the water. Okay, so that works. So that's pretty good. I can't really get across the water at all. So there's no kind of like boundaries between these things. And that's something that we'll talk about with our more complex auto tile setup. So one thing you'll notice is that there's no transition from one type of terrain to another. And that's because we're just using these basic tiles. And it's a little tricky because if we wanted to have that transition, and this is why we're going to use our auto tile. So if you imagine, if I wanted to have that transition, I'm going to get my drawings for a second. So I'm going to erase this. Oh, this always happens. Okay, I have to quit Epic Pen and start it again. I don't know which one it is that causes that issue. Start it again. Okay, so I'll get my pen. Okay, there we go. Let's make it a little bit wider. So I'll choose the pink color. So I might want to have some kind of transition between my grass and my water, like some little beach section. And so I could make some tiles that, you know, have this like little area here, but that would only work if the grass is on top and the water is on the bottom. What if I had like water over here? Then I would need a transition this way. And if I had water up here, then I would need a transition this way. If I had water somewhere in the middle, I would need transitions like all around. So it's actually a lot more complex to add in all of those different tiles. And that's why we're going to look at auto tiling on Thursday. But for now, we're just going to keep working with our basic tiles. So then I can draw some dirt. Maybe there's like some dirt over here. I can draw some lines and get rid of that one. And maybe I'll fill in some more water here. And then maybe there's some more grass over here. So you can make these like big sections of your game and start to design the level. So those tiles all kind of fit together very nicely. And one thing is if I try to add in one of my other tiles, I can't actually layer these tiles. So if I go in and I add my rock, it's going to take up a whole square. And if I add in my tree, it's also going to take up a whole square. So if I want to keep this grass, the way that I can layer is just create a new basic tile map. So that's pretty easy to do. I can duplicate this tile map. And now I want to clear it first. So let's turn off the first tile map I had. And I'm just going to right click and get rid of all this stuff. I can hit Control Shift to drag over an area to erase it. And so now that's still there, but on my new tile map, let's say I could put some rocks here to block this area. I could put some rocks up here to block that area. Maybe I'll put some trees over here, maybe around like this. And maybe put some more rocks up here. You can put stuff around. And so now I have 2 layers of my tile map. And so I can have multiple layers that are using the same tiles. And so now my player can kind of go up near these rocks, but he can't go over. And I could probably make it through the trees. Yeah, I can make it through the trees. So I might need the tree colliders or the trees to be bigger. But we can have this like little forest area. And so we can start to kind of build out our scene by using multiple tiles. Another cool thing that you can do with your tiles, like let's say these rocks, I didn't really like them, or I wanted to have multiple tiles with different colors. I can go into the visibility section and I can change the color. So I can click modulate and I can actually make the rocks different colors. It works better with lighter stuff. Let's see. Yeah, it works better with lighter, lighter colors because you can add more color to it. But that's an option if you want to have multiple tile sets with different colors. I think that's most of what we need to cover. Let's see, is there anything else we need to do? That's pretty much it. We'll go over auto tiles on Thursday. But as far as making basic tiles, that's pretty much everything we need to know. And basic tiles can be useful, especially for adding some scenery. But we'll see on Thursday using auto tiles makes designing a scene a lot more simple, even though the setup is a lot more complicated. Oh, one more thing that we should look at. So when we're going to talk more in depth about colliders next week when we add rewards that we can interact with. But we saw those colliders that are preventing the player from moving through our water or through our rock tiles. And what's happening is we added this little blue collider to our player. And so Godot, by default, if we have two colliders, it's not going to let them overlap. So when the edge of the blue collider on the player hits the edge of the colliders that we added to our tiles, then the player stops. And one thing that we need to start doing is setting up what's called our layers for our collision. So if we look at the player and we go to the collision section in the collision object 2D, you're going to see there's a whole bunch of layers and then there's a whole bunch of masks. And these are just labeled with numbers. But what we want to do is we want to associate layers and masks with different parts of our scene. And there's a lot of reasons to do that, but the main reason is so that parts of our scene can interact. So our player can, for example, interact with our tiles, but they don't interact with like our rewards, because only our player is going to be able to pick up the rewards. So there's a way that we can change these labels. If I go to project and go to project settings, and I'll probably go over this a bunch of times, but I'm going to go down to layer names and go to 2D physics. And so our first layer is going to be the player layer. And our second layer is going to be our tiles. And so if I close that and then click outside, click the player again, now when I open this menu, you can see the first layer is the player and the second layer is the tiles. And so the layer is the thing that the component is on. And then the mask is what it looks to interact with. So for our player, I'm actually going to turn off the mask and just have the player on the first layer. And then for our tiles, I'm going to go to the collision and I'm going to change the layer to tiles and remove the player layer. So I can also do this by just clicking on these squares. But then for the mask, I'm going to leave the player on. So the tiles will interact with the player. So if I play this scene, this is still going to work. Okay, so my player is still getting blocked by the water. If I turn off the mask, you'll see that the player is just going to walk straight through. So it doesn't happen anymore. So the mask is telling the object to look for other objects in the scene. So if I turn on the mask, now it's going to be looking for the player, and the player's on layer 1. And so the player is going to run into it. So that part is kind of important, but it's also a little bit complicated. So I'll talk about it in a couple more contexts. But I think that's enough to get started. So I'm going to pause here.